On a quiet morning, a police officer confronted a man jogging in the park, unaware that this man would later bring the entire system to its knees. How did this simple run turn into a fight for justice that inspired a nation? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking twists in this story. And don't forget to subscribe and share in the comments where you're watching from. The quiet suburban town of Birmingham, Alabama, awoke to another peaceful morning. The sun cast a golden hue over the neatly trimmed lawns and tree-lined streets as birds chirped melodiously from the towering oak trees. In the heart of the town, a public park stretched across acres of greenery, its jogging paths and wooden benches nestled among clusters of blooming flowers. The park, often bustling with families and fitness enthusiasts during the day, was calm and serene in the early hours, with only a few dedicated joggers greeting the morning light. Among them was Malcolm Carter, a familiar face in the community. Malcolm, a young black entrepreneur and community leader, had become a symbol of hope and success for many in Birmingham. Known for his tireless efforts to uplift underprivileged youth through educational initiatives, he had gained respect not just for his accomplishments, but also for his resilience. Each morning, Malcolm began his day with a jog, finding solace in the rhythmic pounding of his sneakers against the paved paths. For him, this ritual was more than just exercise. It was a moment to reflect, recharge, and prepare for the challenges ahead. As he jogged past the towering oaks, Malcolm felt a sense of pride in how far he had come. His journey had not been easy. Growing up in one of Birmingham's most disadvantaged neighborhoods, Malcolm had witnessed firsthand the struggles of systemic inequality. His single mother, who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, had instilled in him the value of hard work and perseverance. Those lessons had carried him through his youth and fueled his drive to create positive change. However, beneath the surface of this idyllic morning lay the simmering tensions that often accompanied the realities of race in America. Despite his success, Malcolm was no stranger to the microaggressions and outright biases that came with being a black man in a predominantly Mitchell town. Yet he had learned to navigate these challenges with grace and determination, using his experiences as fuel to inspire others. Unbeknownst to Malcolm, this morning's peaceful routine would soon be shattered. A single encounter, lurking just around the corner, would test everything he believed in and ignite a chain of events that would ripple through the community and beyond. Malcolm Carter was not born into the life of success and respect he now enjoyed. His journey had been one of grit, determination, and overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds. Raised in the heart of Birmingham's most disadvantaged neighborhood, Malcolm grew up surrounded by the harsh realities of poverty, crime, and systemic inequality. His childhood was marked by the sound of distant police sirens and the hum of late-night arguments drifting through thin apartment walls. Yet amidst this turbulence, there was one constant in Malcolm's life: his mother, Angela Carter. Angela was the epitome of resilience. As a single mother raising 3 children, she worked tirelessly to provide for her family, juggling multiple jobs as a housekeeper and a part-time clerk. She rarely had a moment to herself, but no matter how tired she was, Angela made it a point to instill in her children the values of perseverance, education, and community. She would often tell them, "No matter where you start, it's where you're headed that matters." These words became Malcolm's mantra, etched deeply into his heart. Despite the challenges, Malcolm excelled in school. He had a natural curiosity and a keen intellect that set him apart. However, his path was not without obstacles. Growing up as a black boy in a system that often overlooked or undermined children like him, Malcolm faced countless instances of prejudice. Teachers doubted his potential, and law enforcement viewed him with suspicion. Even as a teenager walking home from school, Malcolm would often feel the weight of judgmental gazes or the distant hum of a police car trailing him too closely. But Malcolm refused to be defined by these experiences. Instead, they fueled his desire to create change. After earning a scholarship to a prestigious university, Malcolm studied business and technology, envisioning a future where he could empower his community through innovation. Returning to Birmingham after graduation, he founded a tech startup focused on providing educational tools and mentorship programs for underprivileged youth. Malcolm's company quickly gained recognition, and he became a respected figure in the community. However, His success did not shield him from the prejudice that often lingered beneath the surface. No matter how much he accomplished, he knew that his identity as a black man meant navigating a world where systemic biases still thrived. These experiences would prepare Malcolm for the storm brewing on the horizon, one that would challenge not just his character, but his very identity. It was an ordinary morning for Malcolm Carter as he jogged through Birmingham's Central Park. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-covered grass and the faint rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Malcolm's steady footsteps echoed along the paved path as he focused on his breathing, his mind already turning over ideas for the day ahead. Clad in a simple gray hoodie and running shorts, he blended seamlessly into the tranquil morning scenery. Little did he know, the peace of this routine was about to be disrupted in a way that would change his life forever. Unbeknownst to Malcolm, a police patrol car had entered the park minutes earlier. Behind the wheel sat Officer Richard Wallace, a seasoned cop with a history of complaints related to racial profiling and excessive force. Richard, who had grown increasingly emboldened by a lack of accountability within the system, scanned the park for anything, or anyone that seemed suspicious. When his eyes landed on Malcolm, running alone through the otherwise empty trail, he made a snap judgment. In Richard's mind, Malcolm's very presence in this setting was cause for suspicion. As Malcolm approached a bend in the path, the crunch of tires on gravel caught his attention. He glanced sideways to see the patrol car slowly pulling up beside him. Unfazed at first, Malcolm kept his pace, accustomed to such encounters from his youth. However, as the car abruptly stopped in his path, forcing him to halt, Malcolm's sense of unease began to grow. The officer stepped out, his hand resting on his belt where his baton hung menacingly. "Morning, officer," Malcolm greeted calmly, keeping his tone polite but guarded. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice sharp and filled with suspicion. Malcolm hesitated, confused by the question. "I'm just jogging. I live nearby and run here every morning." Richard's eyes narrowed. "This park doesn't open until sunrise. You got any hide on you?" Malcolm, keeping his composure, responded, "I don't carry it when I jog, but I can head home to get it if needed." "Note." Richard's tone grew louder, his voice laced with hostility. "I'm not hiding anything," Malcolm replied evenly. "I just came here to run, like I always do." But Richard was not interested in explanations. He took a step closer, his hand gripping the baton tightly. "Don't get smart with me," he growled. "Hands up, now." Malcolm froze, his heart pounding, as the situation escalated. Raising his hands slowly, he tried to reason with the officer. "I don't want any trouble, officer. I haven't done anything wrong." Richard's expression hardened as he swung his baton without warning, aiming for Malcolm's side. Instinct took over, and Malcolm sidestepped the blow, his reflexes sharp from years of martial arts training. In one swift motion, he created distance between himself and the officer, disarming him with a calculated move that left Richard staggered and furious. At that moment, the tension in the park reached its breaking point. A nearby jogger, Maria Hernandez, had witnessed the entire scene from a distance. Shocked by what she saw, she quickly pulled out her phone and began recording. The confrontation was far from over, but Malcolm's life had already been irrevocably changed. What began as a morning jog had now become the spark for a much larger battle, one that would test the fabric of justice and equality in their community. The park, once quiet and serene, had transformed into a tense and chaotic scene. Malcolm stood frozen, his breath quick and shallow, as he processed what had just happened. The officer, Richard Wallace, stumbled backward, clutching his jaw where Malcolm's defensive strike had landed. Richard's baton now lay discarded on the gravel path, a symbol of his sudden loss of control. For Malcolm, years of martial arts training had kicked in instinctively. He had acted to protect himself, not to provoke, but he knew in that split second that his actions would be scrutinized far more harshly than the officer's aggression. Maria Hernandez, a young jogger who had been enjoying the park's solitude, had seen the entire incident unfold. Her initial reaction was fear of becoming involved in something dangerous, fear of retaliation if she stepped forward. But as she watched Malcolm raise his hands and try to reason with the officer, only to be met with unprovoked violence, Maria knew she couldn't remain silent. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and began recording. From behind a tree at a safe distance, she captured every moment. Richard's aggressive demeanor, his unjustified attack, and Malcolm's swift yet restrained defense. Within moments, the wail of police sirens shattered the stillness. 2 additional patrol cars arrived, their headlights slicing through the early morning haze. Malcolm turned toward the noise, his heart sinking as he realized reinforcements had been called. He raised his hands again, hoping to demonstrate his compliance, but the officers who emerged from the vehicles were already on edge. Guns drawn, they barked commands that echoed sharply through the park. "Hands up! Get on your knees!" one officer shouted, his voice filled with authority and caution. Malcolm obeyed, lowering himself to the ground slowly, his movements deliberate to avoid further escalation. He could feel the gravel biting into his knees and the cold steel of handcuffs snapping around his wrists. The humiliation was suffocating, but Malcolm forced himself to stay calm. He glanced toward Richard, who was now standing upright, his face twisted into a mask of anger and humiliation. Despite being the aggressor, Richard wore a faint smirk, as if confident the system would protect him. Maria, still hidden behind the tree, continued recording. Her heart pounded as she weighed her options. Should she step forward and intervene, or should she remain in the shadows? The arrival of more officers made her decision clear. Intervening in person might put her at risk, but the footage on her phone could become a powerful weapon in exposing the truth. She resolved to capture every detail, ensuring that the world would see what had truly transpired. As Malcolm was led to a waiting patrol car, his mind raced with thoughts of his mother, his community, and his future. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated like a criminal. Meanwhile, Maria uploaded her video to social media, praying that it would reach the right people before it could be suppressed. Unbeknownst to her, the video would go viral within hours, igniting a firestorm of public outrage and setting the stage for a battle far larger than the one Malcolm had faced in the park. The turning point had been reached, and the fight for justice had just begun. By the time the sun had fully risen over Birmingham, Maria Hernandez's video had already begun its journey across social media. Within hours, hashtags like Justice for Malcolm and Haustoxic Malcolm and Hostopolis Brutality were trending nationwide. The video captured the raw truth of the incident. Officer Richard Wallace's unprovoked aggression, Malcolm's calm attempts to de-escalate, and his restrained self-defense in the face of unwarranted violence. For those watching, it wasn't just another case of police misconduct. It was a glaring reminder of the systemic biases that continued to plague the justice system. The public outcry was swift and overwhelming. People from all walks of life, neighbors, activists, and even local leaders, poured into the streets to demand justice for Malcolm. Peaceful protests filled the town square as demonstrators carried signs reading "Justice for Malcolm," "Stop Racial Profiling," and "Equality Now." The chants of the crowd reverberated through Birmingham, drawing attention from national media outlets. The protests were not just about Malcolm's case. They became a rallying cry for broader change, fueled by years of frustration over similar incidents across the country. Local organizations quickly mobilized, organizing forums to discuss police reform and systemic racism. Churches, community centers, and even schools joined the conversation, highlighting the importance of addressing these issues head-on. Malcolm's name became a symbol of resistance and hope, inspiring countless individuals to step forward and share their own stories of injustice. His case was no longer just about one man. It was about a system that needed to be held accountable. Meanwhile, in the midst of the uproar, Malcolm's family and close friends worked tirelessly to clear his name. Angela Carter, Malcolm's mother, became a central figure in the movement. Despite the emotional toll, she attended every protest and press conference, speaking with unwavering conviction about her son's character and the injustice he faced. "Malcolm is not just my son. He's a role model for this community," she declared in one emotional speech. "He has done nothing but uplift others, and yet he is being treated like a criminal." Support also came from unexpected places. A young attorney named Sophia Bennett reached out to Malcolm's family, offering to represent him pro bono. Sophia, who had a history of taking on cases involving civil rights violations, was determined to bring the truth to light. As she began building Malcolm's defense, she uncovered troubling details about Richard Wallace's past, a pattern of racial profiling complaints, and a history of excessive force that had been quietly dismissed by the department. This discovery only fueled the community's anger and their calls for accountability. The media played a critical role in amplifying the story. National news outlets aired segments about Malcolm's case, interviewing activists, legal experts, and members of the Birmingham community. The viral video, now viewed millions of times, was dissected on talk shows and social platforms. Human rights organizations joined the fray, issuing statements condemning the actions of Richard Wallace and calling for systemic reform. As the days turned into weeks, the protests grew larger, and the calls for justice became impossible to ignore. Under mounting public pressure, local officials announced an independent investigation into the incident, promising transparency and accountability. The stage was set for a pivotal legal battle, one that would not only determine Malcolm's fate, but also test the community's resolve to bring about real change. What had begun as a single act of injustice had evolved into a powerful movement, one that demanded a reckoning with the deep-rooted inequalities in their society. As public outrage over Malcolm's arrest grew, pressure mounted on Birmingham officials to address the allegations against Officer Richard Wallace and the police department's handling of the case. Facing an increasingly vocal community, the mayor announced the launch of an independent investigation. This decision was welcomed by activists, yet skepticism lingered. Many feared the inquiry would end up as just another attempt to placate the public without delivering meaningful change. However, Malcolm's legal team, led by the determined Sophia Bennett, refused to allow that to happen. Sophia wasted no time diving into the case. Her first move was to obtain surveillance footage from the park where the incident had occurred. However, when she reached out to the city's maintenance department, she encountered a troubling response. The footage from the day of the incident was unavailable. The official explanation was that the camera system had experienced a malfunction, conveniently erasing the recordings. This raised immediate red flags. Sophia suspected tampering and pressed further, but her inquiries were met with silence from the police department. Undeterred, Sophia shifted her focus to uncovering Officer Wallace's history within the force. Through public records and internal leaks, she discovered a disturbing pattern. Over the past 5 years, Wallace had faced numerous complaints for misconduct, many of which involved accusations of racial profiling and excessive force. Despite these allegations, he had been cleared of wrongdoing in every case, thanks to a combination of internal investigations and conveniently missing evidence. Wallace's unchecked behavior painted a damning picture, one that Sophia was determined to present in court. Meanwhile, investigative journalist Michael Harrington, known for his hard-hitting reports on police corruption, joined the fight. After reading about Malcolm's case, Michael contacted Sophia and offered to help expose the truth. Together, they began interviewing witnesses, digging into police records, and analyzing the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Wallace to operate with impunity. Michael's journalistic instincts led him to a key breakthrough, a whistleblower within the police department who revealed that the missing surveillance footage had been deliberately deleted. The whistleblower, a young officer named Chris Turner, admitted he had been ordered by a superior, Officer Matt Gibson, to erase the recordings to avoid unnecessary trouble. This revelation was a turning point in the investigation. Michael published an expose detailing Wallace's history, the whistleblower's confession, and the suspicious handling of evidence in Malcolm's case. The article, accompanied by Maria Hernandez's viral video, ignited a new wave of protests and amplified calls for accountability. Public trust in the police department plummeted as more people questioned how such abuses could go unchecked. Amid the growing turmoil, Sophia tracked down Maria Hernandez, the jogger who had filmed the incident. Initially reluctant to step forward, Maria eventually agreed to testify after Sophia reassured her of legal protection. Maria also provided the original video, which became a cornerstone of Malcolm's defense. With these critical pieces of evidence in hand, a courageous whistleblower, a damning video, and Wallace's documented history of misconduct, Sophia was ready to take the fight to court. The investigation had not only exposed the corruption within the police force, but also galvanized a community determined to demand justice, not just for Malcolm but for all who had suffered under a flawed system. The packed courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Malcolm Carter's trial began. Every seat was filled, and the overflow spilled into the hallways, where reporters, activists, and curious onlookers anxiously awaited updates. The stakes were high, not just for Malcolm but for the entire Birmingham community that had rallied behind him. Outside, chants of justice for Malcolm echoed through the streets as protesters held signs demanding accountability and reform. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, with every word and gesture scrutinized by the assembled crowd. The prosecution, led by an assertive attorney named Karen Mitchell, wasted no time in painting Malcolm as the aggressor. In her opening statement, Karen emphasized Malcolm's martial arts training, suggesting that his skills made him dangerous and that his actions were premeditated. The defendant used his physical expertise not to protect himself, but to attack a police officer performing his duty, she declared, her voice firm and persuasive. She highlighted Officer Richard Wallace's injuries, framing him as a victim of an unprovoked assault. The narrative was clear. The officer was upholding the law, and Malcolm was a threat. Malcolm sat silently at the defense table, his face calm but his hands clenched under the table. His attorney, Sophia Bennett, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. When it was her turn to speak, Sophia rose with quiet confidence. Her opening statement dismantled the prosecution's argument piece by piece. "This case is not about self-defense," she began. "It's about a man who was unfairly targeted because of the color of his skin. It's about systemic abuse of power." She pointed out the inconsistencies in Richard Wallace's report and highlighted the viral video, which contradicted his account. The trial's first day focused on testimony from Richard Wallace. The officer took the stand with a stern expression, recounting the events as though he were the victim. "He looked at me with anger," Wallace said, his voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "I was performing my duty, and he refused to cooperate. I feared for my safety." Karen Mitchell leaned into his narrative, asking leading questions that emphasized Malcolm's physical strength and alleged hostility. To many in the courtroom, Wallace's performance seemed rehearsed, but it was effective in swaying some initial opinions. When it was Sophia's turn to cross-examine, she approached the stand with deliberate precision. Her questions were sharp, each one targeting a hole in Wallace's story. "Officer Wallace, you claim you felt threatened, yet the defendant was unarmed, dressed in jogging clothes, and complied with your commands until you drew your baton. Can you explain why you felt the need to use force before announcing an arrest?" Wallace hesitated, his confidence wavering. "It was instinct," he muttered. Sophia pressed further. "Instinct to protect, or instinct to provoke?" The turning point came when Maria Hernandez's video was introduced into evidence. Played on a large screen, the footage showed Wallace initiating the confrontation, swinging his baton without provocation, and Malcolm reacting defensively. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the narrative Karen Mitchell had constructed unraveled. The prosecution objected, questioning the video's authenticity, but Judge Caldwell overruled, admitting it as critical evidence. By the trial's midpoint, the momentum had shifted. Sophia called Maria Lopez to the stand, where the jogger testified about what she had witnessed. Her voice was steady, despite her nerves. "I saw Officer Wallace swing first," she said. "Malcolm only defended himself after he had no other choice." Maria's testimony, coupled with the video and the whistleblower's revelations about the deleted park footage, painted a damning picture of systemic corruption. The courtroom was gripped by every word, and as the trial progressed, it became clear that Malcolm's defense wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about exposing a broken system. The evidence, the witnesses, and Sophia's relentless cross-examinations laid bare the truth. Malcolm was not a criminal, but a victim of prejudice and abuse of power. The community's fight for justice was reaching its crescendo, and the verdict would determine whether that fight would bring about lasting change. As the trial came to a close, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The jury had deliberated for hours, and the weight of their decision was palpable. When the foreperson finally returned with the verdict, the room fell silent. "In the case of the state of Alabama versus Malcolm Carter," she began, her voice steady but carrying the gravity of the moment, "we find the defendant not guilty." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by cheers and applause from Malcolm's supporters. Tears streamed down Angela Carter's face as she clutched her son's hand, her faith in his innocence vindicated. Outside the courthouse, A sea of protesters erupted in celebration as news of the verdict spread. The chants of justice for Malcolm transformed into jubilant cries of triumph. The case, however, was about more than just Malcolm's acquittal. It had become a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice and the abuse of power. The momentum generated by the trial led to a renewed focus on police reform, with local officials announcing sweeping changes within the Birmingham Police Department. Among these reforms were the mandatory use of body cameras for all officers, independent review boards for handling complaints, and comprehensive anti-bias training programs. Officer Richard Wallace, who had initiated the confrontation with Malcolm, was charged with falsifying his report and abusing his authority. The whistleblower's testimony about the deleted park footage also led to charges against Officer Matt Gibson, who was found complicit in covering up evidence. For the first time in years, the department faced real accountability. Meanwhile, Malcolm, though relieved by the verdict, felt the weight of his newfound role as a symbol of hope and justice. Refusing to let the moment pass, he turned his focus to action. With the support of his community and legal team, he launched Empower Birmingham, a community center aimed at mentoring youth, providing legal aid to marginalized individuals, and fostering dialogue between the public and law enforcement. The center quickly became a beacon of hope, drawing attention from across the nation. Malcolm's story also inspired broader change. Activists and organizations used his case to push for policy changes at the state and national levels, sparking conversations about racial profiling, police accountability, and systemic reform. Though the trial had ended, Malcolm's journey was far from over. He vowed to use his voice and platform to continue fighting for justice, ensuring that his case would not just be a victory for himself, but a catalyst for lasting change in his community and beyond. Malcolm Carter's story is a powerful reminder of the importance of resilience, community, and standing up against injustice. It teaches us that systemic change begins with individual courage and collective action. In our daily lives, this means recognizing and addressing bias, whether in our personal interactions, workplaces, or institutions. It's crucial to listen to marginalized voices, challenge stereotypes, and actively promote fairness and inclusion. One key takeaway from Malcolm's journey is the power of documentation and solidarity. Maria's decision to record the incident highlights how everyday actions, when combined with truth, can expose wrongdoing and spark transformative change. This encourages us to be vigilant and proactive in holding systems accountable, whether through advocacy, supporting community initiatives, or demanding transparency. Moreover, the story emphasizes the value of building supportive networks. Malcolm's community rallied around him, demonstrating that real progress often requires collective effort. It's a call to foster strong, inclusive communities where individuals feel empowered to speak up and support one another. Finally, Malcolm's decision to create a community center shows the importance of giving back. His journey challenges us to not only seek personal justice, but also work toward a future where everyone has equal opportunities to thrive. Today's story is not just about confronting injustice, but also a lesson in the power of community and the courage to stand up for what's right. If you were in Malcolm's situation, what would you do? Type 1. Would you dare to stand up and fight for the truth, even knowing the risks? Or Type 2. Would you choose to stay silent to protect yourself and avoid conflict? Leave a comment with 1 or 2 below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like and subscribe to help us share more meaningful stories.